Steve Andreas, Six Blind Elephants, page 143. I remember a mini paradigm shift I experienced one Sunday morning on a subway in New York. People were sitting quietly, some reading newspapers, some lost in thoughts, some resting with their eyes closed. It was a calm, peaceful scene. Then suddenly a man and his children entered the subway car. The children were so loud and rambunctious that instantly the whole climate changed. The man sat down next to me and closed his eyes, apparently oblivious to the situation. The children were yelling back and forth, throwing things, even grabbing people's papers. It was very disturbing, and yet the man sitting next to me did nothing. It was difficult not to feel irritated. I could not believe that he could be so insensitive as to let his children run wild like that and do nothing at all. It was easy to see that everyone else on the subway felt irritated too. So finally, with what I felt was unusual patience and restraint, I turned to him and said, "Sir, your children are really disturbing a lot of people. I wonder if you couldn't control them a little more." The man lifted his gaze as if to come to a consciousness of the situation for the first time and said softly, "Oh, you're right. I guess I should do something about it. We just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. I don't know what to think, and I guess they don't know how to handle it either." Suddenly I saw things differently. I behaved differently. My irritation vanished. I didn't have to worry about controlling my attitude or my behavior. My heart was filled with immense pain. Feeling of sympathy and compassion flowed freely. Everything changed in an instant. Reviewing a parent's childhood, learning experience will often change how children view their parents. Reviewing a parent's childhood learning experience will often change how the children view their parents. This was a major part of Virginia Satir's family reconstruction process, in which a client would view a reenactment depicting their parents' experiences of growing up. This often helped them gain a new perspective in which the parents' unpleasant behavior was understood as their response to painful limitations in the parents' past upbringing, rather than a response to the client or to someone else in the present. Any exploration of the influence of past events on the present will enlarge the scope of experience in this way. Psychoanalysis can be understood as primarily using the one pattern of extending scope into the past. Consequences. Directing attention to the consequences of an event increase the scope of time and space in the future. The additional information this provides may change how we categorize and respond to an event. For instance, asking a parent to think about the impact of their present behavior on their children's future life may motivate them to rethink what they are doing and consider changing it. When someone gets upset and goes ballistic, it can be useful to point out that when they get so emotional, it makes it really easy for the other person to focus on their intense response and dismissing their concerns as unreasonable. Oh, he gets so upset. I can't talk to him when he's like that. That additional scope can provide powerful motivation to stay calmer, so that the other person will be able to hear and respond to the complaint. When pleasant events in the present lead to pleasant consequences, there is no problem. But sometimes a pleasurable behavior leads dependably to unpleasant consequences, like overweight, hangovers, accidents, and other unwanted results. Being able to vividly imagine those future consequences can be a major factor in being motivated to easily and congruently refrain from present temptation, what is often called willpower. The same is true of the reverse situation. When present tasks are unpleasant, but they result in desirable outcomes, a larger scope of time can make motivation to continue with a difficult task much easier, a topic that I have discussed in detail elsewhere. My father died when I was 9 years old. One consequence of that was that as I grew up, I had only my mother to advise me. And there were many things I had to learn on my own, by trial and error. I hated it at that time, and felt very unlucky. However, as a result, I became quite experienced at going into an area that I knew nothing about, asking a lot of stupid questions, and eventually becoming quite skillful and successful. Now, looking back on my youth, I feel quite lucky to have had the opportunity to learn how to do that, despite the discomfort at the time. Many people who are troubled by impulsive behavior that does not include the scope of future consequences either don't see very far into the future, or the future that they do see is so far away that it has very little impact. One impulsive client saw tomorrow as a very small gray steel photo, a city block distant, so it had almost no impact on her present. That made it very difficult for her to do any planning that involved the future. In contrast, a man who taught long-range planning seminars saw 5 years in the future about 12 inches in front of his nose, 10 years at 18 inches, and 15 years at 24 inches. He also saw these images as fairly large 3D movies in color, so they were very real to him, and they had a big impact on his present decisions. The way someone's scope in time extends into their past and future is called their timeline, and its location and shape has a big impact on their decisions and behavior. For example, some people's future is located above them or behind them, nearly or completely out of sight. If someone's past is behind them, rather than off to the side. It may be very hard for them to learn from past mistakes. If someone's unpleasant past is right in front of them, it may be very hard for them not to dwell on it and be depressed. Those are just two of many other possibilities. Many other aspects of timelines are discussed elsewhere. Recently, I worked with a woman who had a phobia of driving at night, the result of late-night crash in which she was injured. She could drive in the daytime without distress, but at night she recalled an image of the oncoming car and flashed back to her fear just before the crash. Rather than use the standard NLP phobia cure, which changes the scope and space, I decided to explore how useful it would be to ask questions to expand her scope and time instead. First, I asked her if she was satisfied with her behavior in response to the oncoming car, and found that she was. She was alert to the danger, and had quickly and automatically steered away from the oncoming car, but hadn't been able to avoid the crash. If she hadn't been satisfied with her response, I would have asked her to think of what she could have done differently, and rehearse this new response. This shifted her instantaneous image of the oncoming car to a short movie that included her skillful attempt to avoid the car crash, a change in scope that made her feel stronger. Then I pointed out that she was a competent driver who had done all she could in a very difficult situation. So if a similar situation ever happened in the future, she knew what to do and could be confident that she would do it quickly and automatically. Her nonverbal posture changed, indicating a much more resourceful response. Although I didn't ask, I assumed that she recategorized her experience in some way. For instance, from something like fear and vulnerability to competence in very difficult situation. Then I asked her to expand her short movie of the oncoming car to a much longer movie that included all the subsequent events beyond the crash itself, including her eventual recovery from her injuries and her ability to drive comfortably during the day and early evening. These simple changes in scope changed her response from agitated fear to calm competence. Misusing a larger scope. Usually, enlarging scope is useful, but like any skill, it can also be misused. People sometimes use their ability to forecast the future to predict that they will always be troubled by a traumatic memory or a present difficulty. Nearly every week I read reports in a local newspaper of people saying things like, "I'll always be tortured by thoughts of his death," or "These scars will haunt me for the rest of my life," or "I will carry this pain with me to the grave." This kind of statement reveals an unwarranted extension of a present problem into a much larger scope of future time, something that is not useful, and tends to prevent any attempts to change it. I call this future telling without being properly qualified. And I jokingly ask people to show me their fortune-telling license, to point out the absence of any real basis for their certainty that the problem can never be solved. The prediction that a problem can never be solved is a categorization of the problem that prevents any attempt to resolve the problem itself. By refocusing attention on the scope of their problem now rather than their pessimistic long-range forecast, we can return to useful problem solving and often find a solution. A similar prediction that present happiness will last forever may feel better for a while, but it is a setup for future disappointment. Reframing patterns based on smaller scope. A smaller scope is simply the reverse of going to a larger scope, reducing the amount of information. A smaller scope allows us to attend more fully to what remains. For example, some years ago, some friends of mine were remodeling their kitchen. They had torn out the hood that vented smoke and fumes from the stove out of the house, leaving a ragged hole in the wall with some ugly scrapes, grease stains, dirt, and cobwebs. They had an elegant gold leaf picture frame in a closet, and when they placed it over the hall, it suddenly became a very interesting abstract composition that wouldn't have been out of place in a museum. The frame reduced the scope, changing a scruffy piece of wall into a work of art, a very different category. Earlier, I asked you to imagine being in a small space with nothing else nearby, and notice your feelings as you expanded your scope to include familiar surroundings, family and friends. If you imagine being in that larger scope and then shrink it down until you are alone, your change in categorization and response would also reverse. If your family and friends are supportive, you might feel lonely when you made the scope smaller. But if they are intrusive and unpleasant, you might feel safer and more relaxed when you are alone. Reducing scope is particularly useful when you want to sleep or enjoy a pleasant sensual experience, undistracted by other events around you, whether real or imagined. It is also very useful when you want to stay focused on accomplishing something important and you need to temporarily exclude other important concerns or irritating distractions. By deliberately excluding information that is irrelevant for your immediate outcome, you can give it your undivided attention and accomplish more. Whenever someone says that they are overwhelmed by events, that is a clear indication that they need to reduce the amount of information that they are attempting to process. Reducing their scope of attention in space and or time can reduce the amount of information and make it manageable. Often, it is very helpful to literally push away the overwhelming images, making them smaller and farther away, giving you space to decide which part of it really need your attention and which parts can be dealt with later, or perhaps even ignored permanently. For instance, this morning while proofreading, I was distracted by images of some things that I need to do later in the day. These images were in my head, so I imagined pushing them out to the side. First left and then right, then behind. This helped a little, and behind was a little better than the sides, but they were still distracting. When I tried to push them out to the front, that made them even more distracting. When I pushed them up out of the top of my head, they became smaller, colorless, silent, and much less distracting. Slowing the tempo of time is another way to make it easier to process events, because that gives you more time to respond to them. Slowing time is similar to using a microscope, which both reduces the scope that you are attending to and at the same time making that scope larger, more detailed, and easier to see. When we face overwhelm, it makes sense to decrease scope as long as we periodically scan what we are omitting, to be sure that we aren't missing something important to us. When our lives are complex or we have too much to think about, it is very important to limit what we have to deal with, and this can be very useful, particularly if it is temporary. When someone is doing a task that will take some time to accomplish, they often compare what they have already done with how much is left to do, become discouraged and stop. If they use a smaller scope, then they can set a small goal for the next moment, few minutes or half hour, and at the end of that period they can compare what they have accomplished with the goal they set themselves. That is much more likely to result in a positive feeling of accomplishment and continued motivation. For instance, while writing this book, I am focused on the small tasks that I am working on at the moment, whether that is writing, editing, or deciding where a piece of writing ought to go. With this narrow scope, each word that appears on the screen gives me a small feeling of accomplishment and satisfaction at the progress I have made. I feel this even when I write something and then change it or delete it because I want to say it differently, because that is also a small bit of progress. When I explained this process to a friend once, he looked amazed and said, "That's cheating." It may be cheating, but it works. For more on sustained motivation, I see 4 chapter 15. Misusing a smaller scope. A small scope can sometimes be a huge disadvantage, because the information that you need to solve a problem may be excluded from a narrow scope of attention, or the unpleasant consequences of a possible solution may be ignored. This can be particularly troublesome if ignoring a particular aspect of scope becomes long-standing or permanent. Often people learn to habitually ignore their feelings, the view of others, or long-term consequences, etc. And this skews their views and decisions. It is easy to slide into, "This is the only thing that matters," or "That doesn't matter," Tunnel vision is just concentration at the wrong time or place, and then you need to go to a larger or different scope. Reframing using an overlapping scope. Going to a larger or smaller scope, in which the smaller is completely included in the larger one, can be thought of as a special case of overlapping scope, in which the smaller is completely overlapped by the larger. Now, I want to discuss the more general case in which only part of one scope overlaps with the other. Part of what we were intending to is ignored, and an additional scope is added to what remains. For instance, last year my wife Connery and I were driving up a steep mountain road. At one point we found ourselves behind a truck going about 10 miles an hour, and the double yellow line indicated that the passing was not permitted. From the driver's seat, I could see a mile of empty road ahead, so I categorized it as safe and pulled out to pass the truck. From her passenger seat, Connery could only see the back of the truck and double yellow line, so she categorized it as dangerous and became concerned and tense when I pulled out to pass. When her scope changed to the same scope that I saw, she recategorized it as safe and relaxed. Context reframing. The meaning of an event depends partially on the context in which it occurs. For instance, the meaning of helping someone put on their jacket is appropriate for 4 years old, but would probably be categorized as an insult for a 20-year-old, unless the 20-year-old had an injured arm or other disability. In the same way, someone's attempt to help an older person may be perceived by them as insulting, implying that she or he is disabled. When a behavior or response is a problem in one context, it can be useful to think of the same event in a different context, in which it can be seen as positive. A different context provides a different surrounding, and this can change the meaning of the event. When the same event is seen in a different context, we often recategorize it because the new context elicits different criteria. For instance, a father may categorize his son's rebellious behavior as being stubborn, but when he sees same behavior in relation to his resistance to being taken advantage of by a girlfriend or salesman, he will likely categorize it in a much more appreciative way, because the consequences in a different context are very different. One of the fundamental NLP presuppositions is that every behavior is useful in some context. So, if someone is troubled by their response at home, it can be useful to find out where the same response is positive as said, at work, or with friends, or in an imagined context in some other time or place. When you can find one or more contexts in which the troublesome response is useful and positive, that offers a more balanced perspective that provides a good foundation for finding new choices in the context where it causes trouble. Sometimes, of course, it is useful to change the meaning of an event from positive to negative. Someone may view their behavior as very positive, despite its unpleasant consequence or the pain it causes others. Then you can shift scope in the same ways to make these disadvantages more obvious. For instance, an EMT's ability to quickly assess situation and do what needs to be done and tell others what to do is very valuable in the context of a life-threatening emergency. But if he or she uses that same skill at home when there is no emergency, it will prevent children from learning how to acquire that skill for themselves. So far, I have described examples of changing the context in someone's internal images. Changing the actual external context is even more powerful in eliciting a different categorization with a different response. Bill O'Hanlon describes a couple whose marriage was on the rocks because their argument quickly escalated into nasty fights. The counselor suggested that the next time they began an argument that seemed to be getting out of control, they should take a brief break and then meet in the bathroom. The husband should take off all his clothes and lie down in the bathtub. The wife was to stay fully clothed and take a seat next to the bathtub on the toilet. They were then to continue the argument where they had left off. As you might imagine, it was difficult to have an argument that way. The husband felt absurd and exposed, and wasn't his usual self. The wife thought it was hilarious and couldn't quite work up her usual head of steam. But as the counselor suggested, for the next several weeks they dutifully performed this task, each time they had an argument. After a few times of heading for the bathroom, however, they learned to modulate an argument so that it never went out of control. When things would start to get heated, one of them would glance toward the bathroom, and the other would say, okay, let's just calm down and see if we can talk this out. This change of context, the different scopes of experience provided by the bathroom and the husband lying in the bathtub without clothes, naturally elicited responses in both of them that made it impossible to argue in the way that they had been. O'Hanlon's books are full of examples of changing the scope of a problem in space or time in order to bring about change. In addition to changing the context, you can change the timing, the sequence, how something is done, and add a new element to the problem, or subtract one, etc. You can experiment freely without having any idea of what kind of change in scope will be useful and find out what works. For instance, a couple who always argued when the husband came home from work decided to wait for any discussion until after he had showered and changed out of his work clothes. After that, they seldom argued.